Bring in show music, please.
This is Squawk Pod, and I'm CNBC producer Cameron Costa. On today's episode, headlines from around the world. A special sit-down interview with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer while he's in town for the UN General Assembly.
We have to be clear that Russian aggression cannot succeed.
His stance on geopolitics and Starmer's meetings with bank CEOs and former President Trump. Less than 50 days out from the U.S. election, the PM says the world is watching.
Undoubtedly a hugely important election, a very close election. I think all of us are watching intensely.
And another Keir, NBC's Keir Simmons, what he's taking away from this week at the United Nations.
It really is a litmus test for public opinion, for world opinion, and that is one place where Israel is struggling.
Plus the other headlines to launch you into your weekend. On the global front, a change to Japanese leadership and economic opportunity in China. And stateside, tech darling OpenAI is making some big changes, and Sam Altman's compensation is caught up in the story.
If he's that key and it's worth that much, then I can't see how you wouldn't expect to have a share of what that thing's worth.
It's Friday, September 27th, and Squawk Pod begins right now.
Stand Becky by in 3, 2, 1. Cue it, please.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We are live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. I'm Becky Quick, along with Joe Kernen and Andrew Ross Sorkin, and here we are. It's a Friday.
Do I need a jacket? Do I need a jacket?
Well, you look...
Okay. All right.
You look fine. Okay. Andrew, you look great.
Okay, I didn't bring one.
I'm sorry, I didn't bring one either.
No one told me.
I didn't bring one either. It is a Friday, and we do have some breaking news from Japan overnight. Former Defense Minister Shigeru Ishiba is set to become the country's next prime minister. That comes after winning the ruling party's leadership election. He is expected to be formally approved as prime minister on October 1st. Ishiba has endorsed the Bank of Japan's policy of steadily raising interest rates, and he's voiced concerns about the depreciation of the yen. His opponent in the space supported ultra-low rates. Those results came in after the Nikkei closed higher by more than 2%, but Nikkei futures fell sharply after those results. You can see down by about 2.5%. Of course, yesterday we spoke with David Tepper, and while he was saying he's so positive on China, he was saying he'd steer a little clearer of Japan. At least he'd go to Europe, even invest there before he would go to Japan, yeah, because of the yen-related issues. What's going to happen if it appreciates? The yen reversed its losses, though, surged against the dollar, and that kind of plays into what he was talking about.
If China runs and they get the economy going and you get the animal spirits going, what happens? Chinese throw a lot of money in their economy. Who's one of the biggest beneficiaries in their own economy? Is Japan. And Japan, if they start running faster, I don't care what this election is, and they're worried about this candidate and that candidate. Some candidates might want to go to Abenomics, and I don't care. They don't even understand it yet. This just happened last night. The market doesn't understand it yet. What's going to happen? Japan's going to run too fast if they really stimulate there. And when Japan runs too fast, they're going to have to raise rates. And when they raise rates, the yen's going to appreciate. And if the yen appreciates, then you have to be careful about the stock market.
Let's talk about Chinese markets closing out their best week in nearly 16 years after the government announced a new slate of stimulus measures for the economy there and the markets. The mainland's CSI, I should say, 300 up 15.7%. The Shanghai Composite up 12.8%. Meantime, the Hong Kong Hang Seng closing higher by 13%. And one interesting note, guys, is that among the big winners from China's gains, billionaire Bernard Arnault, his net worth soared yesterday by $17 billion thanks to a 10% jump in LVMH as investors bet that stimulus measures would revive China's appetite for luxury goods. You'll remember we talked to him during the Olympics, and one of the big issues has been just the slowdown, the meaningful slowdown in China. In fact, a lot of people were going to Japan, frankly, to buy some of their products if they were buying those products. And so he had fallen down the list of some of the wealthiest people in the world, and is now climbing that ladder back up again. I think he's now.
He was the wealthiest at one point. I think the last I'd heard, he
was the
five or
wealthiest.
something. I wonder if this puts him back in the
switcheroo where Ellison, actually, Larry Ellison, started to move up, and I think the China issue pushed some of this down.
Yeah.
But you just think about that.
Everything Tepper talked about yesterday.
But
right?
think about that. Yeah. But think about your Bernard or no. You're at dinner, and his wife's sitting. He goes, "Wow, you're in a good mood." And he goes, "Well, yeah. How much did we do? How did we do today, honey? 17 billion in a day? You're still young, Andrew, but I'm not optimistic that." But he's like, "God, you're in a good mood."
Let's talk about this deal, because we'll see who's happy when this is over, if it does. DirecTV in advanced talks to acquire rival Dish. That's according to multiple media reports. It could create one of the country's largest pay TV distributors after decades of failed attempts to combine. Past discussions, you may remember, faced a lot of antitrust concerns, but the shift from pay TV to streaming could make the path easier this time. The Wall Street Journal reporting that a deal could be finalized as soon as Monday. DirecTV, owned by AT&T and TPG Capital. Dish is part of Charlie Ergen's EchoStar. And, it's interesting, guys, because we talk about antitrust and how we think about markets and market sizes and all sorts of things. And this is something that they were talking about as a potential years ago and said you need to sort of look towards the future. The world's going to change.
Yeah.
They knew it, but the regulators didn't. Anyway, here we are.
It's funny because I was thinking the same thing driving in this morning, Andrew, just that to be going after those companies, this must get an easier pass, but then you look at the grocery stores that can't team up, and that there's just, the regulators are behind in terms of where the market is on all of these issues. Look for the companies that have really big profit margins. Maybe you have a better idea of where there's anti-competitive behavior. Not that just because you have big profit margins means that, but to go looking where these companies are just getting killed and thinking we're going to slow things down. I had the same thought this morning coming into the show. Let's talk about what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico, in the states all around that. The eye of the hurricane, Helene, made landfall as a Category 4 storm last night. That happened at about 11:10 p.m. Eastern time. It took place in Florida's Big Bend region. Sustained winds at that time were estimated at 140 miles an hour. And the crazy thing about the level of those winds, it's not that it's twice as hard as 70-mile-per-hour winds. Those go up exponentially. So you are talking about brute force that could do an awful lot of damage, and it did. That storm actually weakened to a Category 1 storm as it moved across Georgia overnight. This morning, the National Hurricane Center said that people in Georgia should continue to shelter and stay away from windows. They are calling this a dangerous and life-threatening situation. Already 2 people have been killed in Georgia, at least 1 in Florida. And watching this last night, the storm surge that came with it was really unbelievable. I stayed up till about 10:30 or later watching the video that was taking place on the Weather Channel across all of the places that were with this. The ferocity of this storm, the damage that it's going to do, and the number of people's lives that are going to be impacted. It's still something to be watching very closely, as it is expected to have pretty strong winds and gusts up into states far north from that Gulf.
Said when anyone loses their life, but where was the possible hundreds dead? When you lead with that headline, what? And then it comes out.
Look, it's not daylight there yet, so we'll see what else happened. But
hopefully
the good news,
the good news is
people got out of the way.
It doesn't sound like it's going to be hundreds.
No, I think people took this seriously.
That was the headline yesterday.
Yeah, people took this seriously, got out of the way.
And it's moving. I have property in Georgia, and I'm getting tons of updates constantly, but it's on the other side.
Yeah.
But whatever's left of it when it gets all the way over to the Atlantic. But you always worry. Especially when flooding can be what really damages property.
Yeah, and flooding can be that's the stuff that you really have to watch out for too, and why so many people I think got out of the way.
Now for an update on OpenAI CEO Sam Altman. He held an all-hands meeting yesterday, denying reports that there were plans for Altman to receive a giant equity stake in the company. The company's chairman, Brett Taylor, told CNBC that the board has discussed whether it would be beneficial to the company to compensate Altman with equity, but there were no specific figures on the table. That follows reports yesterday that the board was considering restructuring the company to a for-profit business Now, separately, CFO Sarah Fryer sent a letter to investors yesterday looking to reassure them that the startup is still in a strong position. This despite losing a lot of top talent that we talked about last week. In the letter, which was viewed by CNBC, Fryer saying that the funding round that's underway is oversubscribed and would close by next week. Sources that say that OpenAI will raise $6.5 billion at a valuation of $150 billion. And, I know Sam has been very public about saying that he's made a lot of money already. He doesn't need more money, and that this venture started, as you know, as a not-for-profit and with no expectation that it would ever be more than a research project, right? Like, that's how this began. At some point now, given the profit motives, but not even profit motives, just frankly the amount of money this whole thing requires to work, but also now the valuation, you'd like to think maybe he gets some equity. I don't know, but there's other people, Elon Musk, others would say he shouldn't get anything, right? So it's an interesting one.
I mean, and the number is going to be very interesting to see just how big it is.
If he's that key and it's worth that much, then I can't see how you wouldn't expect to have a share of what that thing's worth. I don't even see how it's
well, and then there's the other question. These investors are all saying we want to have him aligned with the business in some way.
Right.
I don't know. By the way, maybe you don't give him any money up front, but maybe you do some kind of back end thing now. You say, look, we want to send you for the next decade. How do we do that?
Right. You do the Elon deal where you end
we'll
up with
see about
300.
that.
You end up with 300 billion on your way to the first trillionaire.
Cheese will be next.
Coming up, wrapping up the busy week in global headlines at the annual UN General Assembly, from protests about the war in Israel
and said, free Palestine! Free Palestine!
to Ukrainian leader Zelensky on the world stage.
This war can't be calmed by talks. Action is needed.
NBC News' Keir Simmons on the high stakes.
The fact that we're in election season, and then there's two wars.
And Andrew Ross Sorkin sits down with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
It is for the American people to decide who they want as their president, and we will work with whoever is the president.
Squawk Pod will be right back.
You're listening to Squawk Pod with Joe Kernen, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Here's Becky.
Up and Becky, Q.
Welcome back, everybody. World leaders gathering at the UN in New York this week, and there's been no shortage of big headlines coming out of this. Keir Simmons has been covering it all for NBC News, and he joins us on set this morning. Keir, it's great to see you.
Hey, how you doing?
So this has been a really busy General Assembly. It feels like there is legitimate major news almost every hour.
Right. I mean, just so many things. It's hard to remember a time. And I think it's to do with the fact that we're in election season, things are so febrile, and then there's two wars happening right now. Bibi Netanyahu flies in today to give a speech to the UN General Assembly. Protests here in New York overnight, 53 people arrested, thousands on the streets. And then yesterday, you had the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas giving a speech, being given a standing ovation. You have to ask with the United Nations, and there will be many Americans who ask that question, how important is it, given that you have protests for the Israeli leader and a standing ovation for someone like Abbas, who honestly does not have the power to do anything about the situation in Israel right now. But I think with the United Nations, one aspect is that it really is a litmus test for public opinion, for world opinion, international opinion, and that is one place where Israel is struggling. As Benjamin Netanyahu arrives, there is this back and forth, this stop and start over whether the Biden administration got the Israelis to agree to a 21-day ceasefire, or did they not? There's disagreement about that. So demonstrations and disagreement, as Benjamin Netanyahu
Do you think we'll hear that today at this meeting, or at the speech that he's giving? You think that, or you think it's later with Anthony Blinken?
Yeah, I mean, I think the meeting with Anthony Blinken maybe is as important, maybe more important than the speech. I mean, what we'll hear from the speech is the Israeli Prime Minister say what we have heard him say continually, consistently now for the past days, and that is that they are, in his words, determined to ensure that around 60,000 Israelis are able to return to their homes on that northern border with Lebanon, and that they will carry on pounding. And they, just overnight, more missiles and artillery on southern Lebanon targeting Hezbollah. They will carry on doing that, they say, until they get what they want. The question is, can you use an air campaign to achieve that, or will there need to be a ground invasion?
I think the question that we keep asking here is, what's the likelihood that this expands beyond the region, and that it draws in Iran, and then what the response is from the world?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the Gulf states, UAE, Saudis, Bahrain, Qatar, they are kind of desperately hoping that they can get back to some kind of stability. Where they can, because it's, you know, that's what they need for their economy, for their ambitions, for their economies. But you're right. I mean, it's very, very delicate, very tricky. If you just look at Jordan, for example, the enormous Palestinian population there, what impact does it have on Jordan? What are the risks with their location, kind of caught between Israel and Iraq? With that
and
border.
Taking any refugees that come across, as they have been for years.
Exactly. And look, this is just one aspect of this week. We have the Ukraine, the Ukraine challenge.
Yeah, Zelensky, former President Trump talking about how he's going to be meeting with Zelensky this morning here in New York.
Yeah.
That's been a pretty hot button issue, to be in the middle of this election where Democrats were kind of on one side and some Republicans have taken the opposite stance.
Yeah, listen, when you talk to Republican lawmakers, they have expressed frustration over a sustained period that they have felt, many of them, that the Ukrainian leadership has kind of leaned towards the Biden administration. I mean, inevitably, I guess you could say, I mean, that's where they get $61 billion of funding from. It's been authorized by Congress, but it's the Biden administration that has led that. But there are those back in Ukraine, in the Zelensky government, who are questioning how things went this week, how President Zelensky managed to appear to fall out with President Trump and with J.D. Vance, why he gave that interview to the New Yorker where he described J.D. Vance as extreme. It's not, the Ukrainians over many years have tried to walk a line with American politics, despite some of the complaints by Republicans, and they fell off that balance.
It's very weird how political it all is, and you would think, you could almost say that the support for Israel, you maybe question some of the Biden administration's withholding of certain weapons, whereas you think Trump and Vance are ready to get 100% behind Israel, but not necessarily Ukraine.
Right.
And so even there, you can almost see a disparity between the way things are viewed. I mean, I myself wonder what the end game is in Ukraine. I have no idea whether are we anticipating a total victory for Ukraine at some point? What does it look like?
Yeah.
And then you've heard, even though I don't think they said it at the time, but Lloyd Austin said, yeah, we do want to see a degradation of the Russian army through what happens with Ukraine. So that was not what was stated as the objective of why we were doing this either. So it's almost like it is somewhat nuanced, the way we do things.
Right. And perception, even with a war, perceptions are important. The way things are sold, if you like, the way things are.
You got to have the hearts and minds.
Right, and so there have been. I think we forget that the Ukrainians have had huge victories, just holding off the Russians in the early stages, and then getting back a large amount of that, a big chunk of that territory in Donbass. That was a big victory. I think historians will look back and ask whether the Ukrainians were right to kind of put out there that their idea of what they wanted to achieve, their victory, was going to be to get all the territory back. I think they would argue, well, how do you continue to motivate? How do we continue to motivate our people if we aren't telling them that we can get this? Right. Yeah. So again, this war has changed so much. I mean, when you think about that, it's not possible anymore to fly from Europe to Russia. the impact on the Russian economy. And autocracies like Russia take a long time to see the impact sometimes. But I think it's important to keep that in mind as Zelensky himself says, as we inch towards what may be the final chapter of all this.
Sure. Keir, it's great to have you here.
Is it an Irish origin, do you think, or Scottish in your case? Because I don't know. I mean, we have another gentleman named Keir.
Keir, yeah. The Prime Minister, yeah.
Yes. In your case, do you know if it's Irish or Scottish?
My mum was Irish.
Irish?
And it's Scottish.
And it's Scottish. Because I'm looking at the derivation, and it says it's a single-syllable name that packs a lot of punch.
There you go.
And I think it's
I'll
true.
take it.
It packs it, and so do you.
I've never Googled my name.
You've never Googled it. I do things like this.
Do you believe that?
I do things like this.
Do you believe me when I say that? I want to see if the accent gets me over the line.
Well, I told you, if you move over here, you can become an actor immediately. You don't even have to take acting lessons. Just use the voice, and people are like, oh my God, he's fantastic.
The Keir that Andrew spoke to this week is more important.
He might be more. He might to some people. Yeah. To some people, just slightly.
Well, you're very important to us.
Yes.
So
Keir, bless
you. Thank you, Keir Simmons.
It's a pleasure.
We appreciate it.
UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is pursuing investments from America's biggest banks and tech giants while here in New York for the UN General Assembly. He met with top executives from Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Morgan, Carlyle, and Blackstone. And I sat down with him and asked him to talk about his big pitch to the business community.
We now have a Labour government whose number one priority is wealth creation. Now I said that to the Business Roundtable this morning. It's counterintuitive. They don't expect a Labour government to say wealth creation is the number one priority, but it is. Of course we want good public services. Of course we want the NHS, our National Health Service, to work well. But the only way that'll happen is if we grow the economy and have wealth creation. So we're a Labour Party that is proud to say that we are pro-business just as much as we're pro-worker.
Meantime, geopolitics, as you might imagine, front and center. The UK blocked some of the arms exports to Israel, and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is coming to New York right now saying that sent a, quote, horrible message. I asked Starmer why he thinks that Netanyahu, he believes, is wrong.
Look, I support Israel's right to self-defense. What happened on the 7th of October was the most appalling terrorist attack, the worst loss of life since the Holocaust. And that went very deep, and we have been very clear in our support of Israel's right to self-defense. Within international law, our domestic legislation is very clear about the conditions in which we can allow arms licenses to go ahead. We reviewed that and came to a clear decision. Having got a decision that they ought to be suspended, I wasn't then going to put it on one side. I was going to implement it. So I think it is perfectly possible, perfectly reasonable and right to say we support Israel's right to self-defense, but as we would with any country in the world, within the context of international law.
Well, within the context of international law, do you then say that the U.S. is breaking international law by continuing to provide different arms to Israel?
No, we talked to our US colleagues about this. We talked before our decision. I was over with President Biden just 2 weeks ago. But it's a different regime. It's a different legal test in the US. So this isn't comparable. It's not a criticism. It's simply we have our own test in the UK. We've applied that test. And the result is we've suspended a small number of licenses. The US has a slightly different approach, and they've taken a different approach.
Do you think that's the right approach? Or it's not your approach?
No. I mean, look, we passed our own legislation, and I think we're bound to follow our own legislation. But that shouldn't be taken as, nor is it, a criticism of the US. We work very closely with the US. We're very close allies. Been a special relationship for a very long time politically, but at the moment, as we've got this volatility in the Middle East and in Ukraine, then the way in which we're working together with the US, I think, is as close as it's ever been, and that's why I had an extended session with President Biden just a couple of weeks ago in Washington to talk through these difficult issues and to test our approaches with each other.
As it relates to Ukraine, Zelensky is asking the US for more arms, as you know. Do you think the U.S. should be giving them, and do you think they should have given them already?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment on what the US should or shouldn't be doing. They've been a key ally, key supporter of Ukraine. The NATO summit here that was hosted in the US was a very powerful statement of NATO allies in support of Ukraine. President Zelensky was happy with the outcome. Of course, we listened very carefully to any requests for further capability from the Ukrainians. We discussed that with our allies, as you would expect, because we have to be clear that Russian aggression cannot succeed. And that is why the resolve is there to support Ukraine for as long as is necessary. And we always listen to what they say about additional capability.
Last night, the Prime Minister met with former President Trump in New York City. The two had never met face-to-face, and I asked Starmer about his interest in meeting both Trump and Vice President Harris in this final stretch of the presidential race.
It's for the American people to decide who they want as their president. We, the UK, will of course work with whoever the president is. We've got a special relationship politically which sits above the particular office in either country, but it's for the American people to decide who they want as president. We will work with whoever is president. Let me ask you this,
though. The mayor of London, who you know very well, said, what I'd say in a respectful way to Americans is, and this is about our election, he says, I don't think you realize that the rest of the world is watching because we've got skin in the game. What happens in America is the metronome that sets the beat of what happens across the globe. It sets the beat for how other politicians behave in an election campaign. What do you think of that?
Well, look, the Mayor of London is entitled to his views. He's a colleague, a friend of mine. I've known him best part of 25 years. But I'm the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I understand the special relationship. And it is for the American people to decide who they want as their president. And we will work with whoever is the president of the US. How do you think
the rest of the world perceives this in particular election in the US and what's happening?
With huge interest. It's undoubtedly a hugely important election, a very close election. I think all of us are watching intensely.
That was UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. I have to say, I got a lot of calls actually just yesterday as I was talking to some of the CEOs before I did that interview who were in with him, and they were very impressed with his approach. Whether he can keep his party on side to continue to pursue this approach, that's probably the big 22 billion pound question, I guess, in the case of the UK. But I want to bring to your attention, I don't know if you saw this, because there's already a new controversy brewing in the past 24 hours, which is that in the fall, this October, the Prime Minister is holding a tech conference for tech leaders. A similar conference was put on last year in the UK by Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister. He was in conversation a year ago with Elon Musk. Well, who is not invited to this meeting this year? Elon Musk, and he has been fighting back. He took to Twitter and said, I don't think anyone should go to the UK when they're releasing a convicted pedophiles in order to imprison people for social media posts. This comes after the Labour Party released some folks from prison in part to try to alleviate some of the pressures on the system. At the same time that they've taken some other people, and there's been a whole back and forth. But it feels oddly reminiscent of something that happened here in the U.S. just 3 or 4 years ago now.
The union stuff.
With Biden, if you remember, where Elon Musk was not invited to the White House.
Yeah, the EV.
During a meeting about EVs. Exactly.
I didn't think it was quite as blatant, Andrew, but to not invite Elon Musk to an EV, I mean, they had the reasons. We know why, but it is glaringly weird. And I would say almost as weird if you're talking tech and the leaders of tech. I mean, even if you don't like Elon or his politics, you just got to hand it to him. I mean, he's just across the, he's everywhere. Neuralink and SpaceX.
I will say Donald Trump said some pretty nice things about Keir Starmer yesterday, and they have not had a great past after they met together. I think they dined for a couple of hours. He said he thought he was very nice.
About 2 hours.
And he ran a great campaign. And Starmer has said things in the past like, well, if you get Trump's endorsement, that tells you a lot about things. But that's kind of been let go. People were calling this a charm offensive.
Squawk Pod will be right back. That's the podcast for today and for the week. Thank you for listening. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernen, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Tune in weekday mornings on CNBC, starting at 6 Eastern and going all the way until 9. Follow Squawk Pod wherever you get your podcasts to listen to us anytime. And please tell us what you think. Send us a tweet at Squawk CNBC, or you can write a brief review on Apple Podcasts. 1, we love hearing from you, and 2, that helps other listeners discover what we do on Squawk Pod. We'll meet you right back here on Monday. Have a great weekend.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.